The river was trying to kill her, and she was letting it. Ketara Oaks floated face up in the Pecos, her arms spread wide, her body turning slow in the current like a leaf that had given up choosing a direction. The water was October cold and brown with flood mud. Her dress, once white, now the color of rust and exhaustion, ballooned around her in the current. Her black hair fanned out like ink spilled on a page. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't looking at the sky. She was looking at something behind the sky. Something only people who have stopped fighting can see. She was 19 years old. She had been running for 6 days, and she had decided, somewhere between the last hill and this river, that drowning was quieter than being caught. Tolliver Boone saw her from the east bank. He was riding south along the Pecos on a chestnut stallion named Verdict, headed toward a cattle job in Fort Stockton. He was 29, broad-shouldered, dark brown skin, a jaw carved with a dull chisel, and deep black eyes that carried the stillness of a man who had once been violent and had chosen, deliberately, to stop. He wore a sun-faded blue shirt, a leather vest with a bullet hole in the left pocket he'd never repaired, and a gray hat with a rattlesnake-skin band. He'd killed 2 men in his life. Both deserved it. He'd spent 5 years since trying to deserve the air he still breathed. He saw the woman in the water, and for 3 seconds he calculated. Then he stopped calculating and spurred Verdict into the river. The horse hit the water, and the cold seized his legs like iron hands. He rode downstream at an angle, cutting the current, and reached her 30 yards from where he'd entered. She didn't fight when he grabbed her arm. She didn't help either. She was limp, not unconscious, not dead, but absent. The way a person goes absent when their body continues without their permission. He hauled her across the saddle, river water pouring from her dress and hair, and rode back to the east bank. He laid her on the grass, pressed his ear to her chest. Heartbeat, slow, stubborn. The heartbeat of someone whose body refused the decision her mind had made. She coughed. Water came up, then air, then a sound half gasp, half growl, a body choosing life against the explicit wishes of the person inside it. Her eyes focused, dark brown, almost black, rimmed red. She looked at Tolliver and flinched, a full-body flinch, violent, starting in the spine and ending in the fingertips. Not because he'd hurt her, because he was a man. Then something worse than flinching happened. She went still. The survival stillness. The stillness she had learned at 12 when her uncle sold her. The stillness she had perfected at 13 when the brand was pressed into her shoulder. The stillness that said, "Do what you're going to do. I've stopped expecting it to be anything but pain." Tolliver saw the stillness and understood it immediately. Not because he'd studied it, because he'd caused it. In another life, in another version of himself, he had been the kind of man that women went still for. The realization hit him like a hoof to the chest. He sat back on his heels, 3 feet from her, and placed both hands on his own knees. Open, visible, still. "I'm not going to touch you again," he said. "Not unless you ask." She stared at him. The river churned behind them, and on her right shoulder, visible where the wet dress had torn, was a brand, a circle with a line through it, the mark of a ranch called the Crossed Zero. Tolliver knew that brand. Everyone in West Texas knew it, and everyone knew what the Crossed Zero did with the people it marked. He looked at the brand. He looked at her face. And the 5 years he'd spent trying to become a different man suddenly had a direction. Before we continue, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Tell me where in the world you are. Don't forget to subscribe too. Now, let's continue the story. Tolliver built a fire on the bank and gave her his vest, his blanket, and the last of his coffee. She took everything without a word. She sat close to the fire, but not close to him, a geometry of distance that spoke louder than language. He didn't ask her name. He sat 8 feet away, feeding sticks into the fire, and let the silence do what silence does when it's offered without conditions. It gave her room to breathe. After an hour, she spoke. Her voice was hoarse from the river, low, roughened by years of disuse. "Ketara," she said. One word dropped into the space between them like a stone into deep water. Tolliver nodded. "Tolliver." Nothing else. The fire crackled its approval. She didn't tell him everything that first night, but she told him enough. She'd been born in a Seminole freedmen settlement near Fort Gibson, Indian Territory. Her mother, Abeni, was Seminole and black. Her father was dead before she was born. When Ketara, Zeno, was 12. Her mother's brother, Declan Oaks, who had gambled away his allotment and owed debts across 2 territories, sold Ketara to a labor broker for $25. Her mother was told the girl had run away. By the time Abeni learned the truth, Ketara was 300 miles south on a ranch in West Texas called the Crossed Zero, owned by a man named Prosper Cline. She never saw her mother again. The Crossed Zero was not a ranch. It was a machine. Cline ran it with 15 hands and a rotating stock of contract workers. People bought from brokers, branded with his mark, and worked until they broke or died. Ketara was branded at 13. The iron was heated in a forge behind the main barn. She was held down while a third man pressed the circle and line into her right shoulder. She didn't scream. She'd already learned that screaming bought nothing in this economy. For 6 years, she cooked, hauled, dug, planted, and endured. She taught herself to read by stealing pages from a Bible left in the outhouse. She memorized the landscape. She counted guards. She studied the river. And she studied the tracker, a half-Comanche man called Sharpe who tracked runaways for Cline. He'd never lost one. Ketara watched him for 3 years. She learned his patterns the way a prisoner learns the warden's schedule. On the night she escaped, she waited until autumn rain swelled the Pecos and the guards stayed inside. She walked out through a gap in the fence she'd been loosening for 4 months, 1 nail per week, pulled with her fingers, hidden under mud. She carried nothing. Not food, not shoes, not even her name, which Cline had replaced with a number. She walked north for 6 days in bare feet through mesquite and cactus. On the 6th day, she reached the Pecos, swollen and fast, and waded in, not to cross, to disappear, because the Crossed Zero had Sharpe, and tracked people who were caught were brought back as examples. The river was supposed to end. Her story. Instead, it was where Tolliver Boone pulled her out and sat 8 feet away and offered coffee without asking for anything in return. That night, after she slept, Tolliver sat by the dying fire and thought about the Crossed Zero. He knew the ranch. He'd worked a cattle drive that passed through Cline's territory 2 years ago. He'd seen the branded workers in the fields, heads down, silent, moving in rows like machines made of flesh. He'd done nothing. He'd ridden past. He'd told himself it wasn't his business. That sentence sat in his chest now like a swallowed blade. He'd ridden past. And now the river had brought him a woman with the Crossed Zero burned into her shoulder and eyes that expected nothing from any man alive. The coincidence felt less like chance and more like a summons, as if the universe had looked at his 5 years of quiet repentance and said, "That's not enough. Now prove it." They rode south the next day, away from the Crossed Zero, toward Fort Stockton, where Tolliver knew a sheriff named Odette Thibodaux, who was honest and black, and didn't answer to ranchers. Ketara rode behind him on verdict, her hands gripping the saddle, her body rigid with the effort of being close to someone without being controlled. Tolliver rode slowly. He stopped often. He asked before every decision, "We'll camp here. Is that all right? I'm going to water the horse. Will you hold the reins?" Every question was a brick in a bridge, not from him to her, from her to herself. Because the first thing captivity destroys is the ability to choose, and the first thing freedom requires is exactly that. On the second night, Ketara asked about his past, not politely, the way a person checks a weapon before trusting the man who carries it. "You've killed people," she said. Tolliver stared at the fire. 2 men. 7 years ago. Why? The first was self-defense. Cheating at cards. Pulled a knife. He paused. The second was beating a woman outside, a saloon in Abilene. I stepped in. It went further than I meant it to. Ketara watched his face. Do you regret it? Long silence. I regret that I was the kind of man who solved things with fists. I don't regret that she walked away alive. Ketara considered this. The kind of man you were. What kind are you now? And Tolliver answered honestly, I'm still deciding. I think every day I'm still deciding. That answer did something unexpected. It made Ketara trust him more than any claim of goodness. Because she'd known good men who smiled and prayed and sold their nieces for $25. Good men who read Bibles on Sunday and branded children on Monday. Goodness, she had learned, was a costume. But a man who said, I'm still deciding, was a man who knew what he was capable of and was choosing, every day, not to be that thing. That kind of honesty was rarer than gold and more useful than a gun. She moved her bedroll 2 feet closer to the fire, 2 feet closer to him. In the arithmetic of a woman who had been owned, 2 feet was an entire country redrawn. On the third day, they saw dust behind them. A single rider, 2 miles back, keeping pace but not closing. Patient, the way a predator follows when it knows the prey has nowhere left to go. Sharpe, Ketara said. Her voice flattened. Fear so familiar it had stopped being an emotion and become a climate. Klein's tracker, half Comanche. He's never lost one. Tolliver looked at the dust. There's a first time for everything. But his hand moved to the rifle on his saddle, and Ketara, who had spent 6 years reading the body language of dangerous men, saw something she hadn't expected from him. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. And readiness, she was learning, was what protection looked like when it didn't come wrapped in chains. That night, they didn't build a fire. They rode by moonlight through a canyon system Tolliver knew from the cattle drive, narrow draws where tracks were lost on rock. He moved through the dark confidently, each turn memorized. Ketara held the back of his vest and felt his breathing. Steady, slow. The breathing of a man who had decided that fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. The tracker's dust disappeared behind the canyon walls, but Tolliver knew it hadn't stopped. Sharpe was out there, patient as death. They had 2 days, maybe less, and somewhere in the dark behind them, a man who had never lost a runaway was following the scent of the one who got away. Tolliver's plan came at dawn, not as an idea, but as a memory. 2 years ago, he'd crossed the Pecos at Skelton's Ford, where the river split around a sandbar island. The east channel was shallow. The west channel was deep and ended in a gorge nobody entered voluntarily. If Sharpe tracked by sign, hoof prints, broken branches, the geometry of fugitives, then the trick wasn't to outrun him. It was to lie to the land itself. Make the ground tell a story that wasn't true. Tolliver had spent 5 years trying to be honest. Now he needed to be the best liar in West Texas. They reached Skelton's Ford by midday. Tolliver laid it out, not as an order, but as a proposal. I need the tracker to believe you went into the West Channel, that you chose the river again rather than be taken back. Ketara's jaw tightened. Because that's what he expects. Exactly. Sharpe tracks behavior as much as prints. If the evidence says you went into the gorge, he'll follow the evidence. Ketara looked at the river. What evidence? Tolliver paused. Your dress. The ask landed between them like a dropped coal. The dress was the last thing she'd taken from the crossed zero. The last piece of the self that had survived 6 years of being called a number. Tolliver saw the hesitation. I have a spare shirt and trousers. They're too big, but they're clean, and they're not his. The word his, meaning Klein, did the work. Ketara looked at the dress. She looked at the river. She looked at Tolliver's face and found what she needed. He wasn't asking her to shed her past. He was asking her to weaponize it. She pulled the dress over her head, handed it to him, and put on his shirt and trousers. The shirt hung past her thighs. The trousers were cinched with rope. She looked like a scarecrow. She looked like a free woman wearing a free man's clothes. She looked like someone who had just set down a weight she'd been carrying for 7 years. Tolliver took the dress to the West Channel. He tore it in 3 places to simulate current damage, weighted the body with a stone, and sank it where the channel entered the gorge, visible enough for a tracker to spot within minutes. He scattered her barefoot prints leading to the water's edge, and nowhere else. The story the ground told was clear. A desperate woman chose the river over capture. Walked in. Didn't walk out. He crossed the East Channel on rock that held no prints and rode south on hard ground. Behind them, the dress floated in the shallows like the ghost of the girl who'd worn it. And the tracker, when he arrived, would read the land and follow the dead woman into the gorge. Because the best lies aren't invented. They're the truth rearranged. That evening, camped in a mesquite grove, Ketara did something that stopped Tolliver's breath. She was sitting by the fire in his oversized shirt, her branded shoulder exposed where the fabric slipped. She touched the brand with her own fingers, not hiding it, examining it. He put this on me to say I was his, she said. But I've been thinking. A circle with a line through it. In mathematics, that means 0. Nothing. He branded me with nothing. She looked at Tolliver. I want it to mean something else. Like what? Like a door. A circle is a room. A line through it is a passage. A way through. Tolliver looked at the brand and saw what she saw. Not a mark of ownership. A threshold. A woman walking through the wall of her own history. Then that's what it means, he said. And the fire sent sparks upward like small bright votes in favor. Fort Stockton sat on the edge of the Chihuahuan Desert like a fist of adobe and dust. It had a courthouse, a jail, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a sheriff's office where Odette Thibodaux kept the law the way a blacksmith keeps a forge. Hot, steady, sharp. Odette was 42, tall, dark-skinned, silver-haired at the temples, with a voice that could gentle a horse or freeze a man. She'd been a Buffalo soldier before the badge. Shot twice, stabbed once, buried a husband and a son to fever. When Tolliver walked in with a barefoot, branded woman in an oversized shirt, Odette set down her coffee and didn't pick it up again for an hour. Tolliver told her everything. Odette listened without interrupting, then looked at Ketara. I need to hear it from you. Don't leave anything out, and don't soften it for my comfort." Ketara spoke for 45 minutes. She named names, dates, locations, the broker, the driver, the foreman who supervised the branding, the guards, their rotations, 11 other branded workers, including 2 children under 10. She described the crossed zeros layout with the precision of someone who had memorized it not for escape, but for testimony. As if some part of her had always known this moment would come. When she finished, Odette's jaw was tight. "This is federal. I need the U.S. Marshal in San Antonio." She looked at Tolliver. "Can you keep her safe for 3 days?" "I've been keeping her safe for 5. 3 more. Then we go get the rest of them." The next morning, Tolliver walked every store in Fort Stockton. Not for supplies, for boots. He went to the general store first, too big. The trading post, men's only. The leather shop at the edge of town. They had 3 pairs of women's boots. One was the right size. Brown leather, worn but oiled, sturdy soles. He paid with money he'd earmarked for the cattle job. Deposit. He carried them back to the jail, set them outside the door of Ketara's room, and walked away without knocking. 2 hours later, he passed her window and looked up. She was standing in front of the small mirror on the wall, wearing the boots, looking at her own reflection. Not smiling. Something deeper than smiling. She was seeing herself for the first time in 7 years wearing something she hadn't been forced into, something chosen for her by someone who had searched a whole town to find the right size. She touched the mirror with one finger, the way a person touches a photograph of someone they're trying to remember, except the person in the mirror was herself. Those 3 days in Fort Stockton were the quietest of Ketara's life. Her room had a lock on the inside. She turned that lock back and forth 7 times the first night, marveling at a bolt she controlled. She slept 12 hours. She read law books the way she'd once read stolen Bible pages, hungrily, in stolen moments. Except now the light was hers, and the moments were too. She wrote letters to the Seminole freedmen settlement near Fort Gibson, searching for her mother. On the 2nd day, she found Tolliver building a shelf for Odette's office. She watched his hands, large, dark, calloused, driving nails with the steady rhythm of a man who built the way some men prayed. "You searched every store," she said. He didn't look up. "They're just boots. Nobody's ever searched for anything for me." He stopped hammering, looked at her. "Then people haven't been paying attention." And the sentence landed on her like the first warm day after a long winter. Not dramatic, just present. Just enough to tell her the season had changed. On the 3rd morning, Odette came with a rolled document and a U.S. Marshal named Calloway. Tall, silent, handlebar mustache, no tolerance for slaveholders dressed as ranchers. The warrant authorized the arrest of Prosper Cline and the seizure of the crossed zero. Calloway looked at Ketara. "You'll need to testify." "I know," she said. "I've been testifying in my head for 6 years. I'm ready to do it out loud." Calloway almost smiled. Odette did smile, and Tolliver, standing in the corner, felt something bloom in his chest. The sound of a woman who had been silent for 7 years, deciding that her voice was the weapon that would end this. Not his fists, not Odette's badge, her words, the quietest weapon in the territory, and the most dangerous. They rode north, Tolliver, Odette, Calloway, 4 deputy marshals, and Ketara at the center wearing her new boots and Tolliver's shirt, and a look that could have started a fire without a match. She had argued to come. Tolliver had said nothing, because he had learned that Ketara's decisions were not his to make, only his to support. Calloway settled it. She's the primary witness. She identifies the workers. She comes. They rode 2 days through mesquite and creosote, and on the second evening, they saw it. The crossed zero, spread across a flat valley like a bruise on the land. A main house, 3 bunkhouses, a barn, a forge behind the barn, and in the fields, rows of figures moving with their heads down. Klein met them at the gate. Prosper Klein was 55, lean, sun-dried, white hair, blue eyes so pale they looked like holes in his face, clean linen shirt, bolo tie with a turquoise clasp. He looked like a deacon. He looked like a grandfather. "Gentlemen," he said, smiling, "and ladies, what brings federal law to my door?" Calloway handed him the warrant. Klein read it without his smile changing. "Involuntary servitude. I run a legal labor operation. Contracts. Wages." He looked past Calloway and saw Ketara, his pale eyes locked on her. "Ah," he said. "Number 7. I wondered where you'd gotten to." Number 7. The way a man says a horse's tag. Ketara's fists clenched. Odette stepped forward. "Her name is Ketara Oaks, and she's not your anything. Not anymore." Klein's smile cracked. "Whatever she told you is the ravings of a half-breed runaway. No court in Texas will take her word over mine." Odette smiled back, the kind of smile that precedes an earthquake. "That's why we brought the court to you." Calloway's deputies fanned out. They opened the bunkhouses. Inside, 11 people, 7 men, 2 women, 2 children, all branded, all underfed, all silent with the specific silence of people punished for speaking. The children were 8 and 9. Ketara walked into the bunkhouse and knelt in front of them. She pulled her collar aside and showed her brand. The same mark. The 8-year-old girl reached out with one small finger and touched it, then pulled her own collar aside. Matching. Same iron. Same forge. Ketara made a sound from a place below language where rage and grief live in the same room. She pulled both children into her arms, and the bunkhouse, which had been a cage for years, became, for 30 seconds, a church. Tolliver watched from the bunkhouse doorway. He saw the children. He saw the brands. He saw the rows of cots and the bolted windows and the bucket in the corner that served as a latrine. And something inside him cracked. Not the blooming kind, the breaking kind. Because 2 years ago, he had ridden past this exact ranch. He had seen figures in the fields. He had done nothing. He had told himself it wasn't his business. He turned and walked outside, pressed his back against the bunkhouse wall. The sun was white and merciless. He looked at his hands, the hands that had killed 2 men, the hands that had pulled Ketara from the river, the hands that had built shelves and driven nails for 5 years as penance. And he understood that the penance had never been enough, because penance without action is just guilt wearing a work shirt. The tears came, not for himself, but for the 2 years he'd wasted looking away. Then he wiped his face, breathed, and walked back inside. Because the man who rides past is not the same as the man who walks back in. And then the bunkhouse door at the far end opened. Everyone turned. Standing in the frame, dust-covered, rifle lowered, was a lean half-Comanche man with sharp, dark eyes and a face cut from stone. Sharpe, the tracker. He had followed the dress into the gorge, found no body, doubled back, and ridden to the crossed zero, not to report to Klein, but because 43 times he had tracked people back to this place, and for the first time, one of them had come back on purpose. He looked at Ketara. She looked at him, the man who had hunted her for 6 years and the woman who had studied him for just as long. "I'm done," Sharpe said. He set his rifle against the wall. 43 people. I brought them all back. She's the first one who came back for them. He looked at Klein, who was being led to Calloway's horse in irons. "I'll testify." 2 words that added 43 names to the record. 43 people tracked, returned, and punished. Each one a count against Klein that no lawyer could argue away. Klein was arrested without violence. He walked to the horse with his wrists in irons and his spine straight, maintaining the posture of a man who believed money would resolve this. It wouldn't. Ketara's testimony, Sharpe's corroboration, and 3 other workers who broke their silence would prove airtight. Klein would be convicted in San Antonio and sentenced to 20 years. He would die in his 8th year of pneumonia, in a cell smaller than the rooms he'd kept his workers in. Nobody wrote his obituary. The crossed zero was seized, the brand stricken from the registry, the forge dismantled, and the irons melted. Melted into nails. Nails that Tolliver Boone would use to build something. But that part comes next. They returned to Fort Stockton as something they hadn't been when they left. Not strangers, not rescuer and rescued, but 2 people who had walked through a fire together and come out, smelling like smoke and new wood. Ketara stayed in town. Odette gave her a job filing reports and organizing the office, work that used the mind she'd been sharpening in secret for 6 years. She was ferocious with paper. She read law books hungrily. She wrote letters to Fort Gibson searching for her mother. 3 went unanswered. The 4th came back in a hand she didn't recognize. Her mother, a Benny, was alive, 60 years old, still in Fort Gibson, still waiting. Ketara read the letter 7 times, then folded it into the pocket of Tolliver's shirt, which she still wore, which she had stopped thinking of as borrowed and started thinking of as chosen. Tolliver took the cattle job he'd been riding toward. But he didn't drift when it ended. For the first time in 5 years, he stayed. He rented a room. He built things, a shelf for Odette's office, a bench for the courthouse porch, a gate for the church schoolyard. The nails were forged from the melted irons of the crossed zero. He'd asked the blacksmith specifically. Every nail he drove was a piece of the brand that would never mark anyone again. Every nail held together something new, something that stood, something that sheltered instead of confined. One evening, 6 weeks after the crossed zero, Ketara found Tolliver sanding the courthouse bench in fading light. She sat on the unfinished wood. They were quiet a long time, sunset behind them, copper and plum. "I found my mother," she said. Tolliver stopped sanding. "She's alive. Fort Gibson." He set down the sandpaper. "When do you leave?" The question hurt him to ask, but he asked it because love, when it grows between wounded people, must never become another cage. "I want to go," she said, "but I want to come back." She paused. "Is there something to come back to?" Tolliver looked at her. "I found you on the wrong side of a river," he said. "Turns out it was the right side." Ketara almost smiled. "That's not an answer. There's a bench that needs finishing, and a man who's still deciding what kind of man he is." "I thought you'd decided. I decided to stop being what I was. I haven't decided what I'm becoming. I was hoping you'd help me figure that out." Ketara looked at the brand on her shoulder. She'd stopped covering it weeks ago. "You know what a circle with a line through it means to me now?" Tolliver shook his head. "A door I walked through. And on the other side? There's a man sanding a bench with nails made from the thing that hurt me. If that's not a sign, I don't know what is." Tolliver's eyes filled. Not sadness. The unbearable, specific joy of being seen by someone who had every reason to look away. "I'm going to Fort Gibson," she said. "I'm going to hold my mother. And then I'm coming back. And when I do, that bench better be finished." Tolliver laughed. The first real laugh in 5 years. It sounded like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time. Rusty and surprised, and letting in light. She went to Fort Gibson. She held her mother. Abeni wept for 2 hours, the specific weeping of a woman who had refused to believe her daughter was lost. Ketara wept too. Real tears, hot and alive, and tasting like salt and future. She stayed 3 weeks. She told Abeni everything. And then she rode back to Fort Stockton because a man was waiting there who had pulled her from a river and sat 8 feet away and offered coffee without asking for anything. She found him on the courthouse porch. The bench was finished. He'd carved something into the underside where nobody would see it unless they lay on the ground and looked up. One word, Ketara, her name. Hidden where only someone looking for it would find it. The way she had been hidden. The way she had been found. She knelt, looked under the bench, read her name, and the sound she made was the opposite of every sound she'd ever made at the crossed zero. It was a laugh. And Tolliver, hearing it, closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, the way the river had washed over her, except this time the current carried them both toward the same shore. Years later, the people of Fort Stockton knew them as the couple who ran the schoolhouse. The broad-shouldered man who built every desk with nails made from melted brands, and the woman with dark eyes who taught children to read. On the wall behind her desk, she kept a framed letter in Abeni's hand. "You were never lost. I was just waiting for you to find your way home." And on the underside of every desk Tolliver built, hidden where only a curious child would look, he carved a name. A different name on each one. 12 desks. 12 names. 12 people who would never be called by a number again. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe to Wild West Talehouse. There are more stories coming from the frontier. Stories of the ones who were branded, the ones who broke free, and the ones who carved their names into wood that would outlast the men who tried to erase them.